The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show. I'm your host, Charles Christian, and for those of you who keep account of these things, this is episode 74. Now, this week we haven't got Janie with us because we've got a very long interview and a couple of other pre-recorded pieces, so Janie's taken the week off, but she'll be back next week. What have we got? Well, we've got an interview coming up very shortly with Kieran Woodhouse. He's a UK-based paranormal investigator, and he's got some very interesting ideas both about the state of paranormal investigation in the UK today, both from the technical point of view and from the commercial point of view. Is it becoming something of a circus, an entertainment element? And he's also got some ideas about whether or not we're living in a holographic world where what we see we can tell, but there we can't detect other creatures, phenomenon in the light spectrum. He uses a very good analogy of an apartment block or block of flats where you sometimes hear people next door, and you sometimes hear floors, furniture being moved in the floor above, or maybe music wafting up from the floor below, but you never actually know who's there, and you're never quite sure. So maybe the paranormal's like that, and we're living on one floor, and the next floor up it's E.T., and the next floor down it's Bigfoot. Anyway, it's an interesting talk, you'll enjoy it. And then we've also got a return of one of Weird Tale Radio's favourites. That's Naomi from Inanna's in Norwich, and she's going to be talking about the upcoming festival of Lughnasadh, or Lammas, which takes place on the 1st of August. And we're running that interview in this show because our next show will actually, some of you will miss Lughnasadh, so we're getting it in before. Anyway, on with the show, and over to the interview with Kieran Woodhouse. And it's my great pleasure to be talking to Kieran Woodhouse, a paranormal investigator. Hello, Kieran.
Hi, Charles.
Hi there. Right, for people who aren't familiar with what you do, just give us a quick rundown of your particular interest in the paranormal.
Yeah, sure. So I investigate as part of a team around England, paranormal investigations, and I've also started doing some on my own and with a separate group of like-minded people. And I currently give presentations around the country as well, which is based on the equipment that's used for paranormal investigations, what I think about the equipment, skepticism towards it, which is surprisingly quite a lot, and my theories on what it is that we're actually interacting with when we talk about spirits.
Right. Excellent. Well, let's work our way through some of those topics during the course of this session. So you've got quite an interest in, if you like, the technical side of ghost hunting, to use it, use a populist term for it.
Yeah, I mean, I do like the equipment. I've always said, though, that the best piece of equipment you can use when on a paranormal investigation is yourself, and the senses that you pick up. And I think the best thing that you can trust is yourself. because you can use equipment that has faulty batteries or that can be affected by things such as electrics or other people maybe manipulating the experiment. But you always know how you feel, and what you see. So I always say that although it's not maybe a piece of technical equipment, we are the best that there can be. But yeah, I think in terms of the technical side of the equipment, I think it's just got a little bit stale with how ghost investigating is done nowadays. And I think it's time that we as a community started to look for better ways to push the boundaries of investigating the paranormal and finding new ways of trying to capture evidence.
Can you expand on that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, one of my theories is that spirits are operating outside of the light spectrum that we can see. So, if we can see 0.05% of the light spectrum, you have to question what's currently existing in the other 99.95% of the light spectrum. And these are frequencies that we can't see or hear as a human being. So I believe that there's a possibility that spirits are operating on these frequencies. I always explain it as a radio. So if you're listening to radio X,
yes,
then that doesn't mean that radio Y doesn't exist. It's still there, you're just not tuned into it. And then likewise, when you swap to radio Y, radio X, you're just not tuned into it. And I'm sure you've had where you've been in a car and your two radio stations have intermingled for a second, and you've had two songs at the same time. So what I think is when somebody sees a ghost or even an alien or a Bigfoot or any kind of cryptoid, it's possible that what's happened is they've just tuned into two stations very briefly, and then people will claim, it was in front of me and then it just vanished before my eyes. And it could just be that you've tuned back out of that frequency back to your normal range. And mediums or psychics could have the ability to tune into both radio stations at the same time, and that's how they can contact spirits from the other side.
Gotcha.
So it's this kind of thinking that got me into what can we do next in terms of investigating and techniques that we can do. So I'm kind of delving more into that. So it involves things like infrared or ultraviolet light to try and capture things that are operating within those frequencies. It involves using various EMF generators to try and see if we can capture things that are operating on different frequencies that we wouldn't normally hear. So it's just that kind of thinking that I'm trying to push towards at the moment.
Is there suitable technology available to do investigations in that way?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of moving towards that way. So recently, the popularity of what's called the spirit box, if you've ever heard of that, that's kind of taken off probably over the last few years. And that, for me, is the starting point of my theory, because as you'll know, it scans through different frequencies.
Yeah.
And the idea is that the spirit uses these frequencies, these airwaves, to communicate with you. So at the very kind of at the lowest form of technology, that is exactly what I want from my investigations. We've used, as I said earlier, we've used EMF generators where we've effectively flooded the room with EMF, although you can't see it.
Yeah.
And then we've used radio scanners to try and tune into these frequencies that we've got flooding the room. Now, interestingly, we did this the once, and we had an EMF meter with us, and we had a REM pod, which it's a piece of equipment that kind of emits its own EMF and picks up any disturbances within the field. So we had these pieces of equipment while we were flooding the room, and they were both silent. They weren't really doing anything, and it was kind of a bit of a dull experiment. Once I turned all the equipment off and effectively emptied the room of EMF, straight away the EMF meter flew right up to red, and the REM pod started going crazy. And it's almost as if what we'd done is prevented the spirit from interacting with us, because we'd blocked his particular frequency within the room. And the second we turned the equipment off, he was able to just walk through the door, free as you like, and could communicate with us on his terms, so to speak.
For the benefit of people who don't know, what's an EMF? What's EMF?
Okay. So EMF stands for electromagnetic field, and an EMF meter, or a K2 meter as it's otherwise known, is basically just a small black box that picks up disturbances in the surrounding electromagnetic fields. You can get ones that make noises if there's a disturbance, but the most popular ones, as you'll see on programs such as Most Haunted or Ghost Hunters, there's just a range of lights going from green, orange to red, depending on the extremity of the disturbance, and the lights will flash if something's disturbing the EMF. And a REM pod, which is a radio electromagnetism pod, which is a bit of a mouthful, hence why we call it a REM pod. Yes. It's basically based on the musical instrument, the theremin, where if you don't touch it, but you just move your hand closer to it and it makes a noise, and as you move your hand away, so it's very similar to that, but the difference is it actually produces its own electromagnetic field, so it picks up a disturbance if something comes near it, and that's why I prefer that over the EMF meter, because the EMF meter was originally designed to pick up any faults in electrical wiring, or if you had a microwave leakage or anything like that. But for some reason, it just became popular on ghost investigations. And it can be influenced by things such as mobile phones, walkie-talkies if you're in a big group, like I say, faulty electrical wiring, plug sockets, anything like that can interfere with it. So it's never 100% accurate. But I find that the REM pod, if that's being disturbed, then there has to be something near it. Because it's producing its own EMF, it kind of has control over what's going on. So if it does get disturbed, it's a little bit more trustworthy.
Gotcha. Okay, and you also suggest that we live in a holographic world or an illusory world.
Yeah, definitely. This is something I kind of picked up through a bit of research myself, but I am a big follower of people like David Icke, and he's the guy that really got me thinking and looking into the nature of reality and how we perceive the world that we live in and why we perceive it the way that we do. Yeah. So, as I mentioned earlier, if everything in the world is just atoms vibrating, and energy vibrating to a certain frequency, then it's almost like nothing is really there. We're creating our own world because our mind is nothing more than an electrical point of data that's decoding the world as we see it and as we hear it, just like a computer does. So if I was stood looking over the road at a car with somebody else, we can both see the car because the car is an electrical point of attention that our brain is decoding so that we can see it. Just like if myself and you now log onto the same web page, even though we're miles apart, we will both tune into the same frequency and we will both see the same web page. So that's what's happened. In my mind, that's what's happening when we're looking out into the world. We're just decoding all these points of attention, all these frequency points, and manipulating it into seeing what it is that we see. So colours, for example, are all just varying lengths of frequency. So if somebody sees the colour green but somebody else sees it as blue, that doesn't mean the person that sees it as blue is wrong. It's just that in their universe, it's blue.
Yeah.
So it's following that theory that we're almost creating our own universe and our own world. And it's with these points of attention that I kind of begin to wonder what's operating on these frequencies, particularly ones that we can't see and we can't access with the human eyes and ears.
Mm-hmm. So that follows through to your idea about the light spectrum, the 99.95 that we can't see. We can't see it, and they can't see us, and it's finding the link between them.
I mean, I always to kind of simplify it for people. I always use a block of flats. So if we're living in a block of flats all on different levels, so you might know that there's someone living above you because you occasionally hear them fudding around, or you might catch a glimpse of them as they get in the lift on the morning. But ultimately, you can't interact with them because they're living on the floor above you. Mm-hmm. So in my kind of theory, I guess what you'd have is like aliens living on the top floor with Bigfoot on the bottom floor. We're somewhere in the middle. Spirits are kind of knocking around at a floor above us, and it's all these levels of frequencies that we can't access unless you're lucky enough to be someone like a medium, or you do kind of interact with a spirit or a UFO for a brief moment. And I think what's happened there is, like I've said, we've just shifted our consciousness and our ability to tune into a particular frequency. So when we die, our consciousness kind of shifts frequency. And we talk about the 99.95%. So this is things like I've said, infrared, ultraviolet, X-ray. So some of these frequencies, we have developed ways of seeing them, but we've had to build machines such as X-ray machines. Ultraviolet torches allows us to see into that spectrum. Infrared cameras, which are great, they allow you to see anything that's kind of emitting an infrared heat. So there are ways of seeing into this world, which is great because it kind of pushes the boundaries of investigating. As an investigator, it allows us to kind of move into new realms that we never have before. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of thinking about how the world is made up and isn't made up, I guess. And then it's thinking then, well, all these mysteries that occur in the world, and not just ghosts, but all these mysteries that occur in the world, is there possibly an explanation that can tie into that thinking?
And as you say, yeah, that would embrace the whole of the paranormal experience.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Like I've said, you've got so many different cryptoids that people see, like Mothman or Bigfoot, or and I don't think anyone's I don't call them liars. I don't believe in them. I genuinely believe people believe that they've seen what they've seen. And it could be that what they've done is just kind of slipped frequencies for a brief moment, and it's allowed them to see a small fraction of that 99.95% of what we wouldn't usually see. I mean, we all have a pineal gland, or our third eye as we call it. The problem is that gets kind of dumbed down or calcified through things that we eat, things that we drink. And a lot of spiritualists believe that this is kind of the portal into expanding our consciousness. And if that's true, then people need to be careful with what they eat and what they drink. And I'm always very cautious of what I eat and drink around an investigation time, because of how it can influence how you feel, what you experience physically and emotionally. So there is a lot to be said for kind of what we're putting into our bodies, what we get out.
I mean, obviously alcohol would be something, and drugs would be something you'd want to avoid. What about food then? I mean, presumably you don't go out for a very heavy curry or Mexican before you.
No, I mean, I did make the mistake of going for a curry the once, and everybody thought they could hear ghosts all night, but it was just my stomach. So yeah, I mean, like I am quite careful. Like, you see people that will turn up and they'll be down in Red Bull because we're on a 6-hour investigation till 4 a.m, or they'll be eating like a big bag of overly sugary sweets, and these things that they get your heart racing, they give you headaches, all these things that's associated with that kind of food and drink. And then at 1 o'clock in the morning, that they wonder why their heart's racing, or they've got a headache. And the problem is people will attribute that to the paranormal. They'll say, I'm getting a sense of anxiety, or my head's hurting, and things like that. And it's quite probably something to do with what they've eaten or what they've had to drink within the previous 3 or 4 hours.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to be said for that on an investigation.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian. Something wicked this way comes. Weird Harvest Press presents Harvest Hymns, the sweet fruits and twisted roots of folk horror, a 2-volume set of books investigating the music of folk horror, featuring contributions from some of the biggest names in the field: Candia McCormack, Johnny Trunk, Maddie Pryor, Sharon Krause, Jim Jupp and Kemper Norton, to name just a few. Available now via lulu.com. 100% of all Weird Harvest Press profits are donated to wildlife charities.
Welcome, fool. You have come of your own free will to the appointed place. It is time to keep your appointment with the Wiccan Man.
If you want to grow your business, save time using the latest tech, and look great online, Weird Appeal Digital can help. We have a free, yes, that's free download listing 40 digital tools, apps and resources to help you grow your brand, promote your project, generate leads and reach your audience. Just go to www.appeal.digital/weirdtales for smart, effective digital design, and your free download. Go to www.appeal.digital/weirdtales.
You mentioned, again while we're exchanging emails, that you've started doing more, if you like, independent work rather than going on organised ghost hunts, paranormal investigations. And you sort of mentioned you think it's becoming a bit of a circuit, and the same places everybody's turning up to investigate the same places, or it's become just a sort of an element of entertainment?
I think it's a case of I think there's elements of all of that in it. I mean, when I first started getting into this, I mean, I've always had an interest in it, but when I decided to actually go out and start investigating, I had to be a paying customer. So, I used to go with various groups. For those of your listeners that aren't based in the UK, we have probably 2, 3 or 4 big companies now that kind of dominate the paranormal investigative circuit around England. So I think I went with a couple of these people or these groups, and it was okay, and I didn't really know what to expect. I wasn't quite clued up on the equipment at that point. I just wanted to see a ghost, as everybody does. And I remember thinking, as my wife brought it for the very first one, she brought it for my birthday, and when I found out the price, I remember thinking, wow, that's quite a lot of money for what we're doing.
Yeah.
The free tea and biscuits doesn't quite cut it for the money that you've paid. And so anyway, we went. It was at Dudley Castle, this one was. And there was about 40 of us. And I remember thinking, this is a lot of people. And they had a resident medium with them who, was kind of on it all night. Mm-hmm. They must have been exhausted the next morning, because they were seeing a lot of activity and sensing a lot of activity. And the more of these kind of groups that I went with, the more I realised that, they are so dependent on the customers and the guests paying their money, and they're charging such a high rate that, there's no wonder that there are elements of fakery involved and trickery. Because they need you to be entertained. If you've paid a fair whack to go on one of these investigations, it would be no good if you left kind of thinking, well, that was rubbish, didn't really see anything.
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't go again, and if you don't go again, word of mouth, as we know.
Exactly. Yeah.
And if you don't go again, that their profit margins kind of go down the swanny, and they look at potentially losing their business. So when I finally went with the team that I'm currently with now, I found that it was completely different. So the prices were a lot cheaper. They didn't push you to see anything. They didn't tell you what it was that you were feeling. They basically just left you to it. And if you did feel anything or sense anything, they'd write it down. And then at the end of the night, you'd all have a big open discussion, and they'd tell you a little bit of history about the place. And it's when that happened that a few things you felt might make a little bit more sense. they would wait until the end of the investigation to do so. So I went with these guys a few more times before they eventually asked me to become part of their group, and that was fantastic. So it was at that point I then realised how much we were paying for places, because as part of the group I became privy to this. So we would go to places where the place would charge us £300. So we knew if we had 15 people, we'd have to charge them £20 each, which is a fair price. But then you see that other groups that would go to exactly the same location, so they'd be paying the same money, but they're charging 60, 70, sometimes £80 to do exactly the same investigation. And I started thinking, this isn't right. But what's happened over time is the locations have started to clock onto this, and they've started to up their prices because they know they can. And when you've got people like Most Haunted who are just going around throwing money willy-nilly at anyone, and basically just getting what they want, it makes what we do as an amateur team, it just makes it a very, very expensive hobby. And because of this, I've started looking, I've recently did one over at my local pub, actually, and I've got another one next weekend over at my local pub. And we've got a few people that have their places of work and they've got a key, so they're allowing us to go. So it's trying to think outside the box and get to places that we can actually afford now, because it's becoming, like I've said, a very expensive hobby to fulfill.
Yeah. I mean, you do notice that some hotels seem to be padding out their winter guest lists by having ghost hunting weekends and the like. More and more of them, you sort of see what their program is for the year, and there's the Christmas and the New Year, and there's something else, and then there's a couple of ghost hunting evenings. You think, well, I lived in that town all my life, and then nobody ever mentioned a ghost there. Spooky looking place, but that's a long way from actually having a ghost. How did you develop your interest in the paranormal? I mean, you've obviously got a substantial one that your wife thought she'd buy you a trip for a birthday present. So you've obviously had a long-running interest in it. What started it all off?
I grew up in a house. I was born into a house that was quite active, actually. My mum's nan used to visit us quite regularly. I mean, there's a few stories there where we had a child gate. We lived in like a masonette on the top floor, and the child gate, my mum or my dad would regularly forget to close the child gate, and if they had, it would slam 4 or 5 times on an evening just to let them know that they'd left the gate open. My mum would come home to find that the ornaments in the living room had been rearranged to how her nan would like it back when she was alive. So even after she'd gone, there was this kind of struggle between them to redecorate the living room. And so it was kind of, it was growing up there and seeing that there are things that can affect and interact with our world that when you first see it, well, you don't see it, and that's the thing. There's these unknown things that are affecting our lives. So I guess that was bound to make me a little bit interested in it. And I was always just fascinated with like ghost stories or anything like alien related or anything like that. And unfortunately, as you're probably aware, as you grow up, life gets in the way. You have to get a job.
Oh yes,
you have to concentrate on paying bills, and and any hobby that you've got kind of falls by the wayside because you're too busy just trying to make it through the day. So that kind of happened, and then I had a really bad accident playing rugby and ended up in a wheelchair for 3 months. So it was at this time where I started watching things like Ancient Aliens and reigniting my passion for, I guess, conspiracy theories and the paranormal. And then the wife obviously noticed that, I was picking up another keen interest in it, and just it was a surprise birthday present. And it was going on that first investigation that really kick-started my theory directly into the ghost, because I do have other, like I've said, interest in UFOs and things like that, but it was that birthday present, I guess. So I've got her to thank for kick-starting it.
Ah, brilliant. And what, obviously, growing up in the house you did sounds spooky enough, but what is your most memorable paranormal experience that you personally had?
Do you know, I think I've probably got 2 or 3, if I may.
Yeah, indeedy, please.
So I guess the one has happened whilst using a spirit board or a Ouija board.
Mm-hmm.
And this happened at Smethwick swimming baths. So we were doing an investigation there, and within the space of about half hour, it's like everything happened, and it blew my mind a little bit. So there was myself and another crew member. We were just patrolling up this corridor. There was only us there, and he had a camera, and I was just walking around asking questions, and we heard a cough. I know this sounds strange, but it sounded like a female cough. Mm-hmm. So I've run down to the bottom of the corridor to see where it was. And at the bottom of the corridor, there's a boiler room, I guess it was, but there was no other way in or no other way out. So it was just the way I'd gone. Mm-hmm. Yet nothing had come past us. So I'm not sure what that was. So as I've turned back round to kind of sign to the other crew member that I don't know what's going on, as I've done that, I've had a really high pitched whistle right in my ear. I could almost, feel the kind of the breath kind of on my ear as this whistle occurred. So that sent me running up the corridor. And then, kind of with the other guy going, yeah, I heard that as well. And I was like, right, so I'm not going mad. And then we decided to carry out a spirit board session. So at this point, some other people had come along, and we were doing some dowsing rods and pendulums and things like that. And myself, the same crew member, and a guest all decided to have a go on the board. So we put it on a windowsill because there wasn't anywhere to do it, and we had a go. And while we were doing it, this guest said, I think this is my dad. So the skeptic in me kind of asked him to take his finger off the glass just in case he was influencing it. And by that, I don't mean he might have been doing it on purpose. There's a thing called the ideomotor effect where he could have been doing it subconsciously.
Yes.
So myself and the other crew member didn't know this guy. He was just a paying guest, never met him before. And I asked him, take your finger off the glass, but continue to ask questions because, we'll see if it's your dad. So for the next 5 minutes, he asked questions such as, what street did we grow up on? What's mom's name? What's the name of my eldest son? How did you die? And it got every single question right. And I can't answer that. I always look at a way of explaining what's happened and why it's happened. But for me, if that's not a spirit, when we're then moving into the realms of some kind of telekinesis or psychic ability, where this person's passing the answers to our minds, and then we're subconsciously moving the glass. But those kind of 3 occurrences, all like I say, all in the stage for about half hour, just really blew my mind. So that would be number 1. Mm-hmm. And then the second one was with a spirit box session. So when my nan passed away, the next morning we all kind of gathered round my mum and dad's, and my granddad asked me and my brother if we could go down to his house and rearrange the furniture because they'd had the bed downstairs and the table upstairs, so he wanted it all moving back. So of course me and my brother went down. While we were there, my brother said to me, do you reckon she's here? Do you reckon we can talk to her? Now, as every good paranormal investigator does, I had a spirit box in my car, mm-hmm. and I decided to go and grab it, and we thought we'd do a short session. So again, for those of you listeners who aren't aware what a spirit box is, it's basically a radio scanner that scans through the frequencies, but instead of stopping every time it finds a frequency, it just continually scans constantly, giving you about a millisecond or so of that frequency. So you effectively just hear short little bursts of words.
Yeah.
And the idea is that the spirit can communicate with you using these frequencies and these words. So got the spirit box out, we turned it on, and I said, Nan, are you there? And we got what sounded like a yes. And I thought, well, it's easy to think you've heard a yes. So we asked again, are you there? And we got another slightly clearer yes. So we thought, okay, fine, let's go with it. So my brother kind of asked, are you in pain anymore? And we got a no. And then I said, Granddad's up at Mum and Dad's and he'll be back later. At which point we heard Raymond, which is my granddad's name. And I thought, well, that's strange. And I said, yes, Raymond, he's at Mum and Dad's. Then we heard Adrian, which is my dad's name. So now I'm thinking, right, what's the chances of this? And then I said, yes, Adrian, Dad. And then she said, Kieran. And I was like, right. Yeah. So she didn't only say Kieran, she said Kieran, which is exactly how she used to say my name. Don't know why.
Yeah.
So I thought, right, well, this is really strange now. Then she kind of went off on one and started talking a lot. And my brother said, who are you talking to? And she said, they're my grandchildren. So for anyone who has done a spirit box, you'll know that it's quite difficult to get quite a long phase, such as they're my grandchildren. And not only that, but obviously we were her grandchildren. So at this point, we've had 3 names and the fact that we're her grandchildren. Very, very strange. And then she kind of went a little bit quiet. And then we said, Nan, what's going on? And she said, terrifying. So I thought, right, what's terrifying? So my brother asked, what's terrifying? And then the spirit box stopped. So I'm thinking, oh, God, the batteries have run out. So I'm banging it on the wall, trying to make it come back on. All of a sudden, it kicks back in. There's probably about 10 seconds of static. And my brother's kind of shouted, what's terrifying? And then we just heard, God.
Ooh.
And at that point, I just dropped it on the settee and left. My brother carried on for a bit, and she told him to go upstairs to her bedroom or something, but it fizzled out. So he eventually came out to me, like, we were both in tears. But I'm not a believer in God, and that just, it kind of, because there's the element of my beliefs being questioned, which kind of shocked me a little bit. But there's also, my nan who she'd passed like 7 hours previous, was clearly very confused, didn't understand what was going on. And we like to think that she was like in a doctor's waiting room or something in limbo, waiting to pass over or to move on or whatever it is that she did. And, the people that she was talking to when she referenced the grandchildren were probably other people that were waiting with her. And I think she might have just been a little bit confused, a little bit scared as to what was going on. But yeah, so I guess quite a long answer that, but I guess those two occurrences always kind of stick in my mind.
No, that's, well, both of those are fascinating, as you say, that the answers are so detailed, and particularly the one where the Ouija board answers were coming from somebody who wasn't actually touching the planchette.
Yeah, so they had absolutely no interaction or no influence over the answers yet. Like I say, it's 5 minutes. There's probably about 7 or 8 questions, and he got every single one of them right.
So, what are your plans for the future? What projects have you got coming up over the next few months?
Well, I've currently launched a podcast myself. Aha. So there's me and another guy called Ben, who's part of our team. So we're going to be hosting a podcast called the Paranormal Paradigm podcast. Mm-hmm. So you can find that on Facebook if you just search for the Paranormal Paradigm. We've got a page and we've got a group. Yep. So there's that side. I've got presentations coming up in Swansea, I think, so Swansea UFO Network on the 30th of October, and Bristol Truth Juice on the 27th of November, where I'll be talking about what I mentioned earlier, like the equipment, what we use. There'll be some pieces of evidence on the presentation that we've captured as well. And I guess just trying to look for more locations. We've got the investigation coming up over at the local pub. We've got, like I said, we've got a couple of other people who are getting the keys to their places of work. One of them was an old pub, but it's now a nursery. And so just some interesting locations that we're trying to find, and just keep trying to push the boundaries. I've also got a book that I've literally just today submitted the final draft, ready for publishing. And again, that's going to be similar to my talks, where it just details the equipment that's used on investigations and what my thoughts are on those pieces of equipment, why we use them, with a few ghost stories thrown in for good measure as well.
Yeah. When is the book likely to be published?
Good question. I'm trying to get it done before the end of the year. I've got a baby due in about 9 weeks or so. So I'm trying to get everything done before he comes along.
What's the book's provisional title going to be?
The provisional title is An Introduction to Paranormal Investigation.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so I think it's the same title as the presentation that I give. So yeah, I mean, like I say, if anyone just heads over to the Paranormal Paradigm on Facebook, they can keep up to date with when it's released or any kind of news or info on my presentations. And they can always, I always say, by any means, please feel free to contact me on my email, which is kieran.woodhouse@gmail.com. I've been amazed actually at the people that have contacted me personally with their experiences and their thoughts. So I'm always open to that.
Yeah. And just point out, Kieran is spelt Kieran.
Yeah, the odd way.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah.
Names like that, there can be several different ways of spelling them, and you can be certain you'll pick the wrong one. It's a bit like Philip. There's so many different ways you can spell the word Philip.
Yeah,
yep.
Absolutely right.
Right. Well, Kieran, spelt the wrong way. Good luck with the future. Good luck with the new addition to the family. And, please keep in touch, and we'll certainly check out the Paranormal Paradigm Facebook. Is it a page or a group?
There's two, so if you like the page and just request to join the group,
right,
we'll just let you in.
You can find it either way. Yeah, Paranormal. Yeah, that's brilliant. Okay, then. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Charles. Speak soon.
And once again, we're with Naomi from Inanna's in Norwich, and today we're going to be talking about Lughnasadh. Over to Naomi.
Hello, Charles. Lovely to welcome you back to our little House of the Weavers here in Norwich on a warm, sticky, humid evening. Lughnasadh. Lughnasadh, I've heard people say more in Ireland than I have perhaps here. I think here many people would say Lammas, and they might not realise the origin of it, but that it is Old English and refers to Lammas, the mass of the loaf, and that, of course, is the clue. Finding out about Lammas some years ago, as I was doing a big ceremony for people, the words Lord and Lady originated from Llafwood and Llafdigger. Llafwood was the guardian of the grain, the Lord, but it was the Llafdigger, the giver of the grain, the lady who shared it out. And that to me is really what this festival symbolises to me. The intensity of the brightness of June sun is gone. Now it begins to mellow. It's still very warm. The evenings are still long, but they are noticeably drawing in. And now there is this kind of rich, golden glow in the air that brings us to this halfway point between the summer solstice and the autumn equinox. The first signs of the harvest are around us. The first harvests are being cut, so this is, of course, the festival of the corn dolly, taking those first
ears of wheat or barley or rye or whatever your crop might be, even if it's decorative grasses in your back garden. You could tie and twist a little doubled over bundle into a little shape of a human being, poke through arms, divide off legs or leave them loose. I like mine to have little bits of leaf and flowers perhaps even in there. It's a nice little decorative addition to that symbol of the first signs of harvest. And even in the tiniest little back garden patch, even if your harvest of seeds that you see is but dandelion and buttercup, they are valuable plants, as we know, and you might choose to collect some little seeds. Maybe you walk past a little bit of grass or verd somewhere and you see a rosehip or two, or a hawthorn with some berries, or some little apples coming, but mostly it's the seeds that we're looking at. That idea that this is the new seeds forming now that will rest through the winter and then germinate in the spring. So it's about the harvest of our own lives. What are we looking at having almost completed or seeing results of at this time? I like that thought. So to celebrate for people, if they want to create a little simple Lammas ceremony, of course, grains of any kind that you could eat and make into a little shape, a symbolic design, twisted, plaited, or a little female or male figure. You can also think of the other things that we get from grain, not just bread, but of course beer, and the stories of John Barleycorn, the moment at which the god is cut from his knees and offers himself as nourishment and tasty beer perhaps as well. But it is the goddess that is the provider. It is she who's kept those lands fertilized and moistened with rain and allowed everything to ripen. So it's thanks to her that we look at all of the development and growth in nature around us. And whether it's vegetables or fruits, seeds, nuts, berries, whatever is now ripe, we could include as part of a Lammas celebratory meal. And also that awareness of heat and water. Last summer, very hot, very dry. This summer, also very hot and perhaps not quite so dry, but certainly extended periods of dryness. So to think about how water needs to return to the land, how we do still need rain to fill out the fruits and the seeds and the vegetables, but not to drown them. So it's that fine balance again of what we need and what we might end up with. And psychologically, I think this is a point. People have perhaps passed exams and thinking about what their next step will be. Will it be more study? Will it be a job? Will it be travel? What will their harvest of this year be? And perhaps also to think about that is something that we can all do. What is the crop of our life that we've grown this year? How can that be reflected in the season around us? And whatever those plans are, whether they're busy plans, introspective, creative, practical, that again we also want to take time to appreciate the season and to enjoy the hum of the bees and the tweeting of the birds, and in my case the whining of the cats and the hedgehogs as they come for their nightly food, and how all of that is part of our own cycle of the journey for this year. It's a new moon just literally as we move into August, so it's a fresh start emotionally, it's new beginnings again. So yeah, there are ways in which things are ending, but new things are always beginning. But that shift from bud to flower to seed or fruit or berry, that's a really powerful image, I think. So maybe make some little table decorations or carry a few little dried seeds in your pocket to remind you What are the seeds of things that you will be holding in life through the autumn and the winter? And this is only the first of 3 harvest festivals.
Yes.
So Lammas or Lughnasadh now, and of course people can look up Lugh, the Welsh god of light and fire, and there are variations and stories and myths and legends all across the UK for him. We can look at the holly and the oak king, having now shifted the balance of the sun. We're now waning half of the year. Holly king now has that golden sun wheel. And we can look at goddess and abundance, goddesses like Pomona of the apples, and create something that reminds us of that fruition and wholeness and sweetness and deliciousness of life. And then, of course, will come the fullness of the harvest. Autumn equinox, many people will call it Mabon, when day and night are again the same length for that night, and then we move on to the third and last of the harvest festivals, the closing of the old year, Samhain, Halloween. But for now, it's just beginning to see all of those fields with their riches, with their treasure. And I think to think about what is treasure in our lives as well. What would we like to keep as treasure? What can be that golden, glowing richness?
Naomi, that was lovely. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you again for coming. It's been a busy season and we look forward to more, but on we go in the cycle of the wheel.
Thank you. And that's it. We're out of time. You've been listening to another episode of the Weird Tales radio show. I'm your host, Charles Christian, and I'd like to say thank you very much for listening, and please tune in again, same time next week for another episode, and you'll be pleased to know Janie will be back. Yes. Until then, here's a final thought. May your gods and goddesses protect you from ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties and things that go bump in the night. Till next week, stay well, stay weird. Good night.
Black Shug, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @urbanfantasist. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.
This podcast is a part of Straight Up Strange Productions. Discover more shows like this one at straightupstrange.com.